Hail, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I was researching United States colored troops and their condition in 1864 when I found during my research an unusual newspaper account that appeared in a Macon, Georgia newspaper titled The Southern Confederacy. That's the name of the newspaper. This article, written by a war correspondent, describes the situation and condition of, quote, the first Negro soldiers ever captured by the Army of Tennessee, end quote. You students of the Civil War know that the Army of Tennessee at this time, late 1864, was commanded by John Bell Hood. And the article continues to discuss this condition, the situation of the captured soldiers, and it notes that they were captured in the North Georgia town of Dalton. The correspondent did not mention any of the prisoners by name, did not mention which regiment they belonged to. But I knew immediately who they were because I've crossed paths with this story before. These are the soldiers of the 44th United States Colored Infantry. Some years ago, I researched the man pictured in these images. His name is Hubbard Pryor. He was born enslaved in Georgia, escaped to Chattanooga in 1863, and enlisted in the 44th in March of 1864. Pryor is pictured here in the ragged clothes he wore when he arrived in Chattanooga, and later in the uniform of a U.S. soldier in the 44th. You students of the Civil War, I'm sure you've seen these images before. They are very well known. They've been often published in books, magazines, online. They belong to the collection of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. So Pryor and his comrades in the 44th garrisoned Dalton when they were surrounded by enemy forces from Hood's army. That was October 13th, 1864, just months after they enlisted in the army. Hood's men were en route to invade Tennessee. There was a brief skirmish before the colonel of the 44th, Lewis Johnson, surrendered the entire regiment. Pryor was one of 600 men who instantly became prisoners. According to various reports, the officers of the regiment of the 44th were stripped of most of their clothing and paroled. They returned to federal lines within days. Pryor and the other men, the enlisted men, suffered a very different fate. The account in that newspaper, the Southern Confederacy, describes the situation. This is an account that I hadn't seen when I did my original research some years ago. I want to read it to you because it talks about their mental condition as well as their physical condition. So here we go. Quote, the first Negro soldiers ever captured by the Army of Tennessee were brought through here today. They wore the Yankee uniform and seemed to step with some regularity. Most of them were young fellows. They were captured at Dalton. Some of them found their masters in the army and remained with them. The able-bodied among them will be put to work on fortifications and to driving wagons. The weaklier ones, who were not able for hard labor on public works, will be turned over to farmers living through the country to feed and clothe them for their services until they can be returned to their real owners. Yesterday evening, I went to the place where they were encamped, being influenced to do so by the expectation of meeting some old acquaintance and a curiosity to see some of their actions as soldiers wearing the uniform of a great government. It was a very different scene from any I had ever witnessed. There was nothing to laugh at. A man with any humanity could not look upon them with any other than feelings of the deepest pity, not on account of any lack of clothes, for these were well enough, but all the peculiarities of right belonging to the race, especially when assembled together in a crowd, were gone. No songs, no dancing, nor any sign of mirth or gladness, and their manner of getting along in camp showed their utter lack of contrivance peculiar to soldiers. They were making up bread, many of them, for supper. The dough was generally made up in their cups. Those I talked with said they were glad to get back home, but their wasted faces gave no confirmatory token. Many of them had never been paid anything, and the most any of them had received was $6 since they were taken to Chattanooga. So think about that story for a minute. What this war correspondent, a Southern reporter, is telling us that it was hard to look at these men with any humanity, without humanity. They were quiet, they were sullen. They said things like they were happy to be back home, but you could tell in their faces that they were not. They had clothes, some provisions, but this is documented by that war correspondent that they were being returned to a state of enslavement, either with farmers in the countryside in a quote unquote temporary situation until they could find their real owners or enslavers. Now, Hubbard Pryor, the man pictured here, was certainly mostly part of that group. He had to be part of that group that were captured. And you may be wondering what became of him. Well, dipping into the research I did some years ago, I can tell you. He remained a prisoner for 7 months, rebuilding railroads and other infrastructure. He was sent to Alabama, to Mississippi, and to the lower part of Georgia. About May 1st of 1865, with the war practically ended, the Appomattox surrender had already occurred. His captors abandoned Pryor and others near Griffin, Georgia. Pryor describes in his pension file how he, quote, walked his way back to his old home in a sick, broken down, naked, and starved condition, the country being everywhere full of returned Confederate soldiers, that he traveled after night and was fearful of being killed by them, end quote. Pryor somehow managed to avoid being killed. He managed to survive all of this. He married, he started a family, and settled in Texas. He died in 1891, about the age of 48 or so. His exact age wasn't known. So there you have the story of Hubbard Pryor of the 44th, and for me, a new report, one that I've never seen before in a newspaper, by a Southern correspondent who's talking about what it was like to walk amongst some 600 men who were captured when the 44th United States Colored Infantry was surrendered at Dalton, Georgia on October 13th, 1864. And thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.